In the heart of the Great Depression, while the Western world suffered from economic collapse, one nation had an economy that grew by a staggering 50% in just 5 years. It was the Soviet Union, a nation that had zero unemployment, sent the first human into space, and a former economic superpower that was unfortunately doomed to fail from the very beginning. A few years ago, I made a video about the rise and fall of the Soviet economy, focusing on why the Soviet managed to become an economic superpower but later collapsed, while dispelling the myth that socialism in itself is doomed to fail. Although, upon further reflection, it kinda did in the Soviets' case, and you will know the reason why soon. In that video, basically, my point is that the Soviets' rapid growth was ultimately unsustainable, and the reason why lies in the fundamental paradox. The very factors that contributed to the Soviets' initial economic expansion also became the reason for its eventual collapse. You see, while the Soviets' economic model was effective in the initial stages of industrialization, they proved inadequate for long-term economic development. The centralized control and emphasis on huge industrial output, while initially driving rapid growth, ultimately led to systemic inefficiencies. Consequently, the mechanisms that facilitated the Soviet Union's initial success ultimately became the primary sources of its economic stagnation and eventual collapse. But the reason I made this video is that I want to examine even deeper into how the Soviet economy really functions. So instead of the why, we will focus on how, dissecting the Soviets' economic system and how society functions in an economic sense. This means breaking down everything from the 5-year plans and industrialization to oil wealth and resource allocation, while examining how these elements interacted and evolved over time. This will allow us to learn about how the regular Soviet people lived during this period and the many decisions made by the Communist Party that led to the Soviets' rise to superpower and collapse into nothingness. So, let's get into it and understand exactly why this grand experiment that started with so much promise ultimately failed. Alright, so to fully understand why the Soviet Union was destined for failure, we need to first examine the political and social situation of the country before the Russian Revolution. In the early 20th century, the Russian Empire was governed by an autocratic Tsarist regime, known for their disconnect from the socio-economic realities of the vast majority of their people and general incompetence of running a huge empire. The economic situation was dire, characterized by a largely agrarian society. And although the empire's largest industry was agriculture, starvation and periodic famines happened quite often. The 1891-92 famine, for example, was a disaster that took the life of 400,000 people, mostly by the cholera epidemic triggered by the famine. The tragedy was, Russia had more than enough grain to feed its starving people. But the peasants used medieval tools like wooden plows and sickles. They rarely had fertilizers or machinery, which was available at the time, and Russia's primitive railways were not up to redistributing grain, leading to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, while the government was focusing on stopping the papers from reporting on it. Russia's lack of industrialization, besides taking the life of 400,000 people, also meant that the empire was trailing behind Western Europe in terms of economic development. Even in some urban centers like St. Petersburg and Moscow, where industrialization did happen, the workers were exploited by their employers. Workers endured grueling 14-hour shifts, 6 days a week for low wages. And the unsafe conditions of the factories made people lose their fingers quite often. The government, rather than addressing these systemic issues, resorted to repression instead. Labor strikes and protests were usually met with force. The social structure of Russia was deeply hierarchical. A small elite, composed of nobility and high-ranking officials, controlled most wealth and influence, while the vast majority of the population, mostly peasants, lived in poverty and had limited rights. This rigid social order was maintained through a system called serfdom, where peasants were tied to the land and to the landowners who controlled them. This system was officially abolished in 1861, meaning that the serfs were no longer legally considered as property of the landowners. But in reality, it trapped former serfs with a debt they were forced to pay for their freedom, effectively trapping them in a cycle of poverty they can never break out of. Meanwhile, the nobility enjoyed lives of privilege and luxury, widening the gap between the ruling elite and the suffering masses. It's easy to see, with hindsight of course, that this environment of extreme inequality between the nobles and the peasants provided fertile ground for revolutionary ideas to take hold. But unlike the gradual, often parliamentary-driven paths to modernization seen in Western Europe, Russia's path to revolution was way more violent and radical. In the UK, for example, the shift from agrarian society to industrial power came along with evolving political institutions and a growing middle class. Russia never had this kind of gradual change, and instead, it embraced the radical philosophy of a man named Vladimir Lenin. Lenin's vision was rooted in the idea of a proletarian revolution, an overthrow of the existing order to establish a socialist state. They promised a radically different way of organizing society, a way that would, in theory, eliminate the extreme inequalities the Russian people face and make society a lot more equal. This promise, as you can imagine, was extremely appealing to the farmers and factory workers of Russia that have been exploited for far too long, leading to several bloody revolutions that eventually led to the rise of the Soviet Union. But why socialism? Well, it started with the ideas of Karl Marx, a German philosopher and economist. In 1848, he wrote a manifesto criticizing capitalism, believing that capitalism was inherently exploitative and unsustainable. Marx argued that under capitalism, the means of production, factories, land, and resources were controlled by a small, wealthy class known as the bourgeoisie. Meanwhile, the majority of the population, the proletariat or working class, were forced to sell their labor just to barely survive. This creates a system of class struggle, where the interests of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat were fundamentally opposed, and the few wealthy elites would always end up exploiting the vast poor majority of peasants. Over time, Marx predicted that this conflict would inevitably lead to the collapse of capitalism and the rise of a new, more equal system, socialism. Socialism, as originally envisioned by Marx, promised a society where the means of production would be collectively owned, rather than concentrated in the hands of a few. By abolishing private property in an economic sense, Marx believed that the wealth created by society would be distributed based on need rather than profit. This, in theory at least, would eliminate the vast inequalities of wealth and power that you often see in a capitalist system. In a socialist state, the class distinctions that define capitalist societies will disappear, leading to a classless society. Workers would no longer be exploited for their labor, and economic activities would be planned democratically to meet the needs of all, rather than the desires of a wealthy elite. Marx's ultimate vision was communism, a stateless, classless society in which equality and collective well-being will be the core of society rather than power and profit. Now, here's the reason why the Soviet Union is doomed to fail. Despite the promise of equality and collective governance outlined in Marxist theory, the political structure established under Lenin and later under Stalin fundamentally contradicted these ideals. The Soviets' version of socialism was a highly centralized and authoritarian state, which Lenin justified as a necessity for achieving and safeguarding the revolution. The Bolshevik Party took control of all political, social, and economic matters, silencing all critics and consolidating power into the hands of a select elite. This structure created a clear hierarchy that was exactly the opposite to the classless equal society that Karl Marx wrote in his book. And the things that the Soviet Union did to their people were arguably worse than what the Russian Empire ever did. Under Stalin, it only got even worse, with brutal purges, forced collectivization, and the use of fear to maintain control. From 1928 to 1953, when Stalin died, a total of 10 million people were supposedly sent to the Gulag. This was data from the Gulag administration themselves, by the way, and some historians suggested that the real number could be up to 40 million people. Now, the reason why I took time to explain the situation before the Russian Revolution is that understanding this hierarchical and oppressive political structure is important for analyzing all economic decisions and why Soviet Union turned out the way it was. On the surface, the standard of living for the people was better under the Soviet regime, and that's great. But a revolution can never truly succeed without changing the underlying political system. During the Soviet rule, the people remained voiceless, and political power remained centralized in the hands of a select few, exactly like before the revolution. The concentration of power allowed the leadership to implement radical economic policies, such as the 5-year plans, with little regard for their inefficiencies or human costs. Economic priorities were dictated from the top down, focusing on industrial output and state objectives rather than addressing the actual needs of the people. These political failures of the Soviet regime became the fundamental reason for its eventual collapse many years later. Alright, let's talk economics. How did the Soviet Union actually put socialism into practice? Well, they started by fundamentally restructuring their entire economic framework. The core principle was state ownership. Everything, land, factories, mines, and resources belonged to the state. To replace the market mechanisms, the Communist Party meticulously set production targets for every sector, from steel production to shoe manufacturing. They determined what would be produced, how much, and where it would go. They allocated resources, set prices, and controlled people's wages. This was achieved by what the Soviets called 5-year plans, and here's how it generally works. First, Stalin and his allies will determine the general direction of the economy, and then a committee known as Gosplan, composed of economists and statisticians, drew up a detailed economic blueprint for the next 5 years. This blueprint consists of the target rate of the nation's electricity output, agricultural goals, transportation networks, and into more industry-specific matters like how many steel and fertilizers each region will produce. It goes even deeper when the targets are further broken down into specific outputs. For example, the state dictated the quantity, quality, shape, and sizes of steel plates, bolts, wires, and so forth. And they also fixed the budgets for firms, determine wages for different jobs and different skill sets, and even give bonuses and punishments for managers, depending on whether they met their production target or not. Now, The biggest and most radical difference between the Soviets' planned economic system and capitalism is in the concept of input and output. In a market economy, businesses are concerned with both. They want to minimize their inputs, aka labor, raw materials, and capital, while maximizing their outputs, aka the goods and services they sell. Economics as we know it is all about efficiency. Because resources are limited by nature, we study economics to determine the most logical and effective use of these limited resources in order to maximize our gain. But in the Soviet system, the focus was primarily on output. The goal was to meet the production targets set by the plan, regardless of the costs. If the plan called for 1,000,000 tons of steel, that's what they aimed for. The question of how you even do that or the amount of resources you should use were secondary. This focus on output rather than efficiency had some pretty significant consequences down the line. Alright, so Stalin's first 5-year plan was published in 1928, and the major reform plan was the industrialization of the Soviet Union. Stalin himself was deeply concerned about the Soviet Union's lack of heavy industry, saying that we are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make good this distance in 10 years. Either we do it or we shall be crushed. This was proven true during World War II, where the Soviets' heavy industry proved to be the key factor to driving back the German invaders. The success of the Soviets' industrialization was the nation's most incredible feat, at least in my opinion. And it's the reason why I'm so interested in learning the economics behind this nation. There are a few ways the Soviets achieved industrialization. First, to get the number of people required to man up lots of large factories, the Soviets moved its people en masse from rural to urban areas to work in the factories. By utilizing the massive peasant population working in highly inefficient village farms and moving them into more productive heavy industry, you gain a sheer growth in economic activity. Entire cities were built from scratch in order to accommodate factories, along with its surrounding cities to house workers and their families. Then, to free up labor and capital for industrial sectors, Stalin implemented forced collectivization of farms. Thousands of small private farms were lumped into one large farm where they had to produce more stuff for the government while also paying more taxes. The logic behind this was that one large state-controlled farm was more efficient than a lot of small farms scattered far from each other. From the government's point of view at least, a collective farm is also way easier to tax and redistribute fruit from. And Stalin hoped to use the tax money and food gained from agriculture to invest in the heavy industry. This reallocation of resources from agriculture to industrial ended up being successful in the short term, but to the detriment of the nation as around 8 to 12 million people died from starvation. This reallocation of resources didn't only come by forcing farmers to pay more taxes though. 80% of the Soviets' industrial output was catered to 4 specific industries: steel, coal, machinery, and electricity. Other necessary industries like consumer goods, for example, took a backseat, as the initial focus was to build the backbone of the economy. Now, the final factor of the Soviets' successful industrialization was that they learned from the West. This might seem surprising because we all know that the Soviet Union was an ideologically self-reliant nation with a strong sense of nationalism. But even Stalin knew that in order to beat capitalism, you have to learn from it. So, the Soviet Union sought help from foreign engineers and even firms to jumpstart its industrial programs. For example, this advanced steel production plant located in Magnitogorsk was designed by American engineers. The Soviets sent a formal delegation to Cleveland and sought the help of Arthur J. McKee Consulting Company. And the city of Magnitogorsk itself was partly designed by a famous German city planner, Ernst May. Perhaps the reason why the Soviet Union struggled to sustain its initial momentum of success was because of brain drain. You see, the Great Purge of 1937, orchestrated by Stalin, targeted not only his political rivals, but also economists, engineers, scientists, and skilled professionals, including many foreign experts who contributed to the Soviets' early industrial successes. It created a talent vacuum, leaving the nation reliant on outdated methods and technologies. And we can see this better leading up to the nation's collapse. But still, the Soviet Union saw significant economic growth during the 1930s, a time when the rest of the world was in the Great Depression. This was used as propaganda, of course, showing the strength of the planned economy compared to capitalism. But propaganda or not, no one can deny the fact that the Soviets' industrialization was a great success, although it came with massive human losses. In less than 10 years, the Soviet Union had turned from a backwards agrarian economy into an industrial powerhouse. Alright, so what was life actually like for the average Soviet worker? The official narrative painted a picture of a worker's paradise, a society where everyone had a job and was contributing to the common good. And in a sense, that was true. Unemployment, as it is understood in market economies, was virtually non-existent in the Soviet Union. That is because under central planning, the state was the sole employer, and from the government's eyes, full employment was a necessity. This didn't necessarily mean everyone was doing fulfilling or productive work, but it did mean that everyone had a job, or at least a place they were assigned to. This led to quite a few problems though. For example, even though people had jobs, they were not always productive, and were given totally redundant jobs. A typical factory in the Soviet Union can have double the employees of a factory in the UK with less productivity. And this worker hoarding phenomenon meant that some people had a daily task of counting endless inventories of nuts and bolts. When people talk about how life during the Soviet regime was better than the Tsar's regime or even today with Putin in charge, the reason was probably the full employment that the nation could guarantee. And there was a certain security in that. Unlike the volatile job markets of capitalist economies, the Soviet system offered a sense of stability that our current society lacks. This wasn't exactly sustainable though, as later down the line, right before the collapse of the Soviet Union, most Soviet industries did try to switch into a full-scale profit and loss accounting so that companies would fire unproductive workers in order to avoid bankruptcy. Exactly like the world that we are used to today. Although even that wasn't enough to stop the nation from collapsing. Now, let's delve into the core problems of the Soviet economic model. The first problem is the incentive problem. You see, in capitalism, incentives are woven into the fabric of the system. Incentives control our lives, shaping our choices and driving our actions, far more than we ourselves often acknowledge. Businesses compete to gain more profits, workers compete for better salaries, consumers demand cheaper and higher quality goods, and people in general just want more, no matter how poor or rich they are. In today's society, the pursuit of wealth is insatiable. But for better or worse, this constant drive for more fuels innovation, efficiency, and economic growth. It's the engine of capitalism, the invincible hand that Adam Smith mentioned in The Wealth of Nations. In the Soviet Union, these market-based incentives did not exist. The Soviet Union kept prices fixed and low, which on the surface was really good for the people. It aimed to provide affordable goods and services to the population, shielding them from the price fluctuations that we see in capitalist markets. But this policy had unintended consequences. Because prices were fixed, there was no mechanisms for supply and demand to regulate the market. If there was a shortage of a particular good, the price wouldn't rise to incentivize increased production. Conversely, if there was a surplus, the price wouldn't fall to encourage consumption. This led to persistent shortages and surpluses, with goods either rotting in warehouses or disappearing from shelves altogether. Now, one specific case that I think shows just how inefficient the Soviet economy can be is by looking at how factory managers do their jobs. You see, the way the Soviet planners tried to increase productivity was to expect the same resources to yield more output next year. They incentivized factory managers by tying their pay to meeting these targets and offering bonuses for exceeding them. This seems logical, but managers quickly learned to game the system. If the target was easily achievable, they stopped production once they hit that target. Why produce more and risk next year's target to be even higher? The last thing these managers wanted was to work hard and surpass this year's target, only to find out that the next year's target was even higher than usual, making it nearly impossible to earn their bonuses. They were essentially punished for being efficient. This created a bizarre situation where production wasn't driven by actual demand or efficiency, but by the manager's desire to protect their future earnings. There's also one more way how factory managers manipulate the system to their advantage and to the detriment of the country. To make sure that they could fill the quotas given to them by the state, they would oftentimes request higher amounts of raw materials than what they truly needed. This guaranteed that even if there were disruptions in the supply chain, that they would still meet the quotas that they were given, meaning that there was a lot of waste within the Soviets' economic system. For example, a factory manager overseeing the production of tractors is assigned to a quota of 100 tractors for the year. Knowing that steel deliveries are often late and unreliable, and that meeting the quota is tied directly to his bonus and his job, he inflates his request for steel by 50% and asks for enough steel to build 150 tractors. Now, even if the steel delivery is delayed or short by a third, he can still meet his 100 tractor quota. The manager gets his bonus and the planners are happy. But what happens to the extra steel? It sits in the factory yard, rusting, taking up valuable space. Nationwide, this practice created a massive surplus of unused materials. Warehouses overflowed with steel, cement, and other resources, while other factories struggled with shortages. This misallocation of resources crippled productivity and created a domino effect of inefficiency throughout the Soviet economy. This sheer volume of resources wasted and rotting in the warehouses was the hidden cause of the Soviets' planned economy. Or in other words, a planned economy will never be as successful if the people making the plans are not aware of what is actually happening outside their office room. Although, it's not that the Soviet Union didn't know about this big problem. It's just that they didn't know how to solve it without attempting a partial or full change to capitalism. In 1917, right before Lenin came to power, he published a pamphlet called The State and Revolution. There, he wrote that managing a socialist economy was as simple as collecting goods and distributing them according to the needs of the people. A simple task that can be done by anyone who can read and know elementary school mathematics. But when Lenin finally came to power, he immediately realized that running a country was way more complex than that. especially using an economic system that has never been used before. Motivating the workforce required intricate wage systems that cannot be controlled by a few people at the very top. And moving food from farms to the urban cities exposed the delicate balancing act between state control and the needs of the rural population. Do you prioritize the farmer's livelihood and take less resources for the factories, or would you sacrifice the farmers in order to industrialize the nation as fast as possible? It's a simple question, but the answer did cause 12 million people to starve to death. And this is what most people don't know. In 1920, Lenin introduced a new economic policy, a partial return to capitalism for the Soviet Union, particularly in small businesses, retail, and agriculture. Only the major industries remained under state control. It sparked a fierce debate within the Communist Party over what degree should the state control the economy, and should the Soviet Union borrow some capitalist economic principles to solve the incentive problem. In 1924, Lenin died without knowing the answer to this problem. And we know that Stalin's answer was forced collectivization. Now, I want to talk about the Soviets' agricultural sector, particularly how it became a persistent and significant weakness within the Soviet economy. Many farmers resisted Stalin's collectivization, deeply attached to their ancestral lands and suspicious of the new government. This resistance was met with brutal force, which involved arrests, deportations, and executions. Millions of peasants were forcibly relocated to labor camps or remote areas, while others faced famine due to the disruptions of agricultural production. The reality of collectivization was far too different from what Stalin had envisioned. Rather than increasing efficiency and production, it led to the deaths of millions of farmers, followed by a significant decline in agricultural production. After all, a dead farmer is an unproductive farmer. This problem actually persisted throughout the Soviet era, which was actually surprising given that the Soviet had an immense amount of land, relatively modern machinery, at least after the 1960s, and lots of farmers. But the Soviets' agricultural output was still below what the country was capable of producing, due to the inefficiencies that we've talked about before. And for some years, the Soviet Union did have to rely on imports in order to feed its people. Alright, so let's move on to the 1960s and 70s, because during this time, the Soviet Union experienced a significant economic shift with the discovery and exploitation of vast oil and gas reserves in western Siberia. The sheer scale of these reserves transformed the Soviet Union into a major energy producer. In 1980, for example, the Soviet Union was the world's biggest oil producer, with 603.2 million tons of oil output. This changed a lot of things for the Soviet Union. First, oil and gas exports quickly became a primary source of foreign currency. This influx of hard currency provided the Soviet Union with the means to finance imports, primarily for food to feed its starving people, and military weapons in order to compete with the United States. Oil also became a powerful political tool for the Soviet Union. They leveraged their energy exports to exert influence over other nations, particularly in Eastern Europe. By providing a stable supply of energy, the USSR secured political alliances and economic partnerships, heightening their geopolitical standing. But the abundance of easy money from oil exports masked deep-seated problems within the Soviet economic system, and this would prove fatal to the nation's survival. This is because natural resources as a money-making machine had a ton of flaws to begin with. First, and the most obvious one, is that oil prices fluctuate heavily and unpredictably on the global market. Remember, The Soviet economy was built on rigid 5-year plans that was pretty inefficient to begin with. But when your primary income source is subject to sudden booms and busts, it makes long-term planning even more difficult than it already was. One year, they might have a surplus of hard currency, leading to increased spending and imports. The next year, a sharp drop in oil prices could trigger a financial crisis. Second, the focus on oil and gas exports led to a neglect of other vital sectors of the Soviet economy. This is based on an economic theory called the Dutch disease, where the immense profitability of the energy sector drew investment and the best talent away from manufacturing and agriculture. Why invest in a struggling tractor factory when you could drill another oil well and earn significantly more foreign currency with less effort? This created a lopsided economy that was heavily reliant on a single commodity and became even more prone to price fluctuations. The Soviet Union, in its pursuit of quick oil wealth, had weakened its own economic foundations and abandoned the industries that made it successful to begin with. Third, the Soviets' natural resources was not as good as it looks on paper. This is because most of the oil deposits in western Siberia were located in harsh climatic conditions, although still less extreme than in eastern Siberia. To give you an illustration, impassable swamps occupy up to 70 to 80% of western Siberia. Geologists could only work in the winter, where swamps were frozen enough to hold heavy machinery. And I don't need to tell you just how harsh the winter is in Russia, making it a nightmare to extract these resources. It makes it even worse when considering that over time, these natural resources were depleting fast. As resources in the closer western Russia began to dry up, they were forced to expand their production to deeper and deeper into the Siberian mountains, where the terrain is even more inhospitable. Not only were the resources the country gained depleted over time, so the country doesn't get as much money, but the cost of extracting these limited resources became even more expensive as time goes by. For example, the Soviets' production of iron ore increased from 142 million in 1960 to 502 million in 1980, making it the world's largest iron ore producer. 15 mines in total accounted for 80% of the Soviets' iron ore production. Every single year, these mines are dug deeper about 12 to 15 centimeters. As the pit became deeper and the route to the surface became longer, it required more expensive equipment to extract these iron ores. The other choice that the Soviets can make is to abandon these mines and search for new mines in the mountains. This country is absolutely blessed with natural resources after all. But it's also an expensive solution that required lots of modern equipment that they just don't have. This phenomenon is called the Ricardian trap in economics. The depletion of existing raw materials meant even greater costs if the output was increased from either new regions or already exploited ones. You can see how a country that became dependent on natural resources began to fall apart once those natural resources disappeared, or at least harder and more expensive to obtain. By the 1970s and 1980s, the Soviet economy began to exhibit clear signs of stagnation. The initial rapid growth fueled by extensive industrialization had run its course, which was replaced by dependence on oil and gas. The inefficient central planning and all the problems that we've talked about before began to take their toll on the entire economy. Productivity stagnated, and the economy struggled to adapt to the changing demands of a modern world. A growing gap emerged between the Soviet Union and Western economies. There was just a lack of innovation throughout the Soviet economy that stemmed from the incentive problem. Unlike in countries where secure property rights and market economies meant that you are rewarded for your ideas, in the Soviet Union, you got fixed wages, factory managers that were deliberately producing less than what they're capable of, and the fear of getting arrested and sent into the gulag meant that there's a lack of general incentive for people to innovate. Couple this with the decline of Soviet heavy industry, the ever-depleting natural resources, the plummeting oil prices in the 1980s, and a general neglect of fulfilling the needs of the people in favor of new military technology, meant that the Soviet Union was doomed to collapse. The people's discontent with the Soviet political system, which prioritized the interests of the ruling class over the well-being of the population, led to economic stagnation and ultimately collapse. The seeds of trouble were already planted ever since Lenin came to power in 1917. This is Doverhill, and see you next time.